Today we'll talk about the cross and some of the important details to think about when throwing it. I've talked about the jab in the past. Right now we're going to think about that straight punch from the backhand, usually thought of as one of the most powerful punches, one of the most direct punches. Again, it's just a straight line between me and my opponent. We can throw a lot of power behind it, but I do see some common pitfalls that I'll bring up, and I'll start, before we get into that, with the most important things to think about when throwing it. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about the cross, some of the important things to think about when throwing it, and then we'll follow up with some of the common pitfalls I see when people strike the bag with the cross, when they throw the cross in sparring, and just in general shadow boxing and in regular movement. So let's check it out. All right, so we're in a fighting stance right here. All right, we have a chin down, elbows in, facing our opponent. All it is a straight line punch from my backhand to my opponent and back. I could throw it to the body, I could throw it to the face, but here I'm in my fighting stance. I'm going to turn, hips, shoulders, knuckle tilted slightly over towards my opponent, and I come back, right? You saw as I did that, my heel turned, my hip turned, my shoulders turned. I drove my power and my strike straight through the middle of my arm, right through those middle knuckles. I kept my chin down, my hand up, right to my opponent's nose, mouth, stomach, whatever, and then I bring it back. So to focus in on a few of those different things, to zoom in, notice that as I did that, I really turned my foot. Sometimes what you'll see people do is they only kind of leave the heel on the ground. You really want to drive off the ground. If this was sand or if the material was a little bit looser, you would see as I pushed, you would see it bunch up behind my toe because I'm driving off the ground. That's why we want a solid base. You want a good fighting stance so that your legs can be strong and pushing off the ground and then driving a lot of power, a lot of force through your strikes. Again, as strong as you are in your upper body, your legs are just a bigger muscle group. They're longer, they're usually more developed, and they're going to have more power if you're throwing than if you just throw with your hands, right? So you want to pivot that hip, pivot that foot, get the heel up, almost point your toe towards your opponent. You want to drive off that hip, right? Drive that hip in front of the lead hip. So if I'm here, you see me from this side, when I throw the punch, I'm not here with my right hip behind my left hip. Now, I'm a righty, so that means I'm going to throw my right hip into the punch. If you're lefty, this would be the opposite. But the idea is my rear hip, for a second, becomes almost the front hip. You can see my right hip, my front hip is peeking around my left hip, right? The one that's typically in front. So that means that I'm really twisting my hips so that I go from this to this, right? I have this 45-degree angle, and then I have this 45-degree angle. So as I drive my hips, I push off that foot. My heel comes up off the ground. I push off that foot. My hip comes forward. And now I'm going to keep my stomach tight so that I could transfer the power of my legs into my upper body. My stomach tight. If I don't keep my stomach tight, I could drive my hips, but it doesn't transfer, right? Notice I'm not pushing into the bag. If I keep my stomach tight as I drive my hips, it starts to move the bag, right? So from here, you're going to make sure that you keep your legs strong. You're going to drive through, keep your stomach tight. And now I'm going to rotate my shoulder through that punch. Notice that I take my lead shoulder and I bring it back. Same way I take my lead hip and I twist it around behind me. I take my lead shoulder and I twist it around behind me so that my arms can move and I make room for this cross to come forward. So I'm going to drive forward, right? Again, from here, I'm going to drive forward. Even if, we'll go into hitting the bag after, but I'm going to drive straight through it. So knees are bent. I pick the heel up. I drive the foot. I turn the hips, keep the stomach tight so it in turn turns the shoulders, and I bring my rear shoulder forward all the way up on my chin, and I drive it. I'm facing you, again, driving, right? Even if I don't extend my hands, boom, this is my punch without extending my arm. Shoulders forward. I'm keeping my knees bent so I have a little bit of suspension. I have a little bit of give in my legs so I can catch my weight as necessary. I bring this shoulder back to allow this shoulder to come forward, okay? So I'm going to drive those shoulders. My hand's going to stay up on my face. Elbow stays by my ribs. And I drive that right hand, my rear hand forward. Notice as I'm doing so also, I'm turning over a little almost bit. Like you're pouring something out. You want to turn that knuckle over a little bit to force yourself to hit with those middle three knuckles, right? So I'm going to turn over and back. One thing I want to make sure you do is that you really thread your arm forward. So it's not about bringing the arm out to the side. That's a little bit more of a hook. You want to imagine you're in a small corridor or a hallway, and you want to turn your knuckles in and not try to, hit the walls on the sides as you come around. You want to go in a straight line forward and back. My elbow should lift up to throw my cross and come back as opposed to bow out and then come back, okay? So again, from the top, I turn my feet, I turn my hips, I turn my shoulders, keep my stomach tight, turn my shoulders, I drive my hand forward, and as I come back, I don't just bring my hand back, I bring my shoulder back, and it drags my hand back with me. So let's use that as the first thing when we start talking about some of the pitfalls, all right? So some of the pitfalls that I see when people throw the cross, and we'll go into that last thing I just demonstrated, is that they retreat their hand but not their body. So what you'll see is even if they do a really good job at driving their shoulder into their punch, they bring their hand back like this, and then they stay exposed. What you really want to do is, sure, yes, you're bringing your hand back to your face. I say that all the time, but the way you do that is by bringing your body back into a resetted position, back into a neutral position. So as I throw my cross, if I focus on bringing my shoulder back, it's naturally going to pull my arm back with me, as opposed to focusing on bringing my wrist or my elbow back. If I focus on that, I'm just going to come here. I want to bring my whole shoulder with me, here and here, right? I turn, I come back. So make sure, as much as you drive your shoulders and your hips into your strike, make sure you bring them back into that neutral position. It's that 45-degree angle, slightly sideways position, right? I come forward, I come back. I come forward, I come back. As opposed to I come forward and I bring my hand back and then I reset. Okay, most people don't end up resetting. You just end up staying here, very square. You want to bring your shoulders back, all right? So make sure we do that. Another thing I see is that people will drop that front hand, and this is probably the most common thing. When people throw their crosses, they drop their front hand. So you'll see a lot of this, okay? Fully exposed over here, my hand's down like I'm bowling with my left hand, right, with my front hand. You want to make sure as you throw that cross, your lead hand is up here, not on your chest, not on your throat, up high on your head. Even here is fine, but I don't even tell people to keep it on their chin, because the truth is, if I tell them to keep it on the chin, most of the time it drops to here. I tell people to keep their hand up high, kind of eye level. One, this can act as a block, but even if you get in a bad habit and you drop it down a little bit, at least it's still protecting your chin and your cheek, okay? So when you throw that cross, make sure you keep that front hand up by your face and bring it back. Always up eye level, right? I turn, my hand stays where it is, it stays high, and it comes back. Another thing I see people do when they throw the cross is they kind of drop it right before. And they do this really with every punch. It's the swoop, right? It's the dip right before the punch. I talked about this in the jab video. Same thing with the cross. I'll see this. And then they end up throwing it from their hip or from their ribs. You want to go in a straight line from your face and out. Imagine that you're in a pool. I may have said this in other videos. I'm probably going to say it in every video because it's an important point. And the pool, the water is up to your shoulders. Your hands are just outside of the pool, basically up to your wrists. You don't want to drop your hands into the water and then have to fight the water to bring them out again. You want your hands to stay above the water and extend straight forward. So that's what you can do when you throw that cross. You can keep your chin down and you can extend straight forward and back. To the side, it's going to look like this. I bring it straight forward and I bring it back. I bring it straight forward and I bring it back, and I don't dip that hand. It acts as a telegraph. It gives a moment of pause or a moment where you're open on that side, and your opponent, if they catch it, boom, they can exploit it to throw a strike to your face, maybe a lead hook to that cheek. So you make sure you want to go in a straight line and back without dropping the hand. Another thing I see pretty commonly is people pick up that back foot when they throw. So rather than plant your foot and drive, what a lot of people will do is they'll almost Superman it, right? They'll try to dive into the punch instead of drive through the punch. So you'll see a lot of this, right? See them pick off the foot. What ends up happening is, sure, my weight goes forward a little bit, but I don't have the same stability in the punch. I don't have the same strength in the punch because I don't have a solid base to push off of. I kind of just lean. I end up relying on momentum, on gravity to bring that punch forward. Plus, now I'm off balance. So when you throw that punch, plant the foot, make sure you're nice and strong here, and you drive into the punch as opposed to fall into the punch. A thing that happens also when we do that is that we end up moving both shoulders forward as opposed to twisting, right? When I foot's on the ground, it's more sensible. It just makes more sense in my body, in my physicality, to turn my shoulders as opposed to when that foot comes off. I end up just diving with both shoulders, and then this becomes the motion as opposed to this. This is where I want. The twist is where the power comes from. That's where the control comes from, as opposed to diving forward where I become off balance. So make sure to plant that back foot and drive off of it. Like I said earlier, try to feel almost as if the ground was going to bunch up behind your foot as you drove that punch when you throw the cross. In similar fashion, a lot of people tend to do what I call the bowler, right? So they pick that foot up, but rather than pick it up in a straight line, they bring it back behind them, okay? So that looks to me like when someone's at the bowling alley and they slide that foot behind them as they throw. What I'd like you guys to do is think about, again, driving off that foot and not sliding it back behind you, because now you throw some of your weight this way. The punch actually gets pulled off in the other direction. This pulls my shoulder back this way. Whether you feel it or not, you're not having the same stability in that punch, and you're not driving forward. So as I'm here, I want to make sure I drive forward and I don't slide my foot back just to get my shoulder around. It's not going to have the same power. It's not going to have the same effect. So be careful about that. Focusing on that back foot one more time, you might be throwing these punches and say, okay, that's great. I keep my foot on the ground. I turn it, right? I'm doing everything Vinny says, but I still don't feel power. Why? Because there are a lot of people that I see, especially in class, that will throw that punch, throw the cross, turn their foot, turn their hip, but they're not actually engaging the foot. It's all for show. They don't realize that it's for show, but they are just going through the actions without actually implementing the purpose of doing those actions, right? So what that might look like is this. I might be in my fighting stance, and I'm just going to throw my cross and turn my foot. Now look, I'm doing this. I'm not pushing off my foot at all. Sure, I'm turning my hip, but again, my foot might as well be off the ground because I'm not doing anything with it. If you're going to push off your foot, you're going to turn your hips, you have to engage that leg. So on the bag, I see it a lot of times like this. So it looks like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but it's only in show. There's no actual engagement, activation of those leg muscles because I'm not driving off of it. I want that foot to drive and push into the bag. So as you're doing these movements, make sure that there's some reason behind it. Make sure that you can actually feel the mechanics of why we turn our hip, why we dig into the ground with our feet, and see how that actually applies to the strike itself. Feel the transfer of power from your legs through your stomach into your shoulders. Just doing this, even though it looks right, is not actually going to have an application. It's just going to be for show if you don't do it in a way that impacts the punch itself. Another thing I see people do when they throw the cross is they drop it right after they throw it. So sometimes people drop it before, sometimes people throw it properly and then drop it right after. So on the way back, they'll throw the cross and then it just sloops down, right? They throw the cross and then they just drop their hand. You have to throw that cross and it has to come back the exact same way. If you watch boxing, if you watch MMA, kickboxing, sometimes you'll see almost an exaggeration of this habit that we establish as fighters, where when they bring the hand back, they almost bring it back in this almost very flamboyant show of bringing the arm back in this big arc. You'll see, bah! Right? The idea, what they're trying to do, it's just training to make sure that after they throw the punch, they bring it back in a straight line and they don't just allow themselves to drop it. What happens is in a big fight, when you got your energy going, when you feel like you're in a little bit of a flow, sometimes that gets exaggerated and you see this kind of big show of a movement. And it's not that they're, again, trying to show off. They're just kind of in the moment. But what it is an artifact of very specifically training, bringing the hand in a straight line back to the face and not dropping it, not looping it after. So as you throw that punch, make sure you go out and you come back in a straight line. Watch yourself in the mirror, videotape yourself, catch yourself if you end up doing this. And then also related to that is when you're hitting the bag, right? Sometimes you might not drop your hand. You might bring it back to your face, but your energy disengages. So when we're hitting the bag sometimes, what we might do is we might throw hard, but then we just stop here. So now, notice, I'm hitting the bag. I'm bringing my hand back to my face, but look at where my energy is. I'm here. I'm hitting the bag. I'm stopping. I'm bringing my hand back slowly. Because the bag's not hitting me back, because it's not a sparring partner, because it's not a trainer tapping you and making you think, always bring my hands back to my face. What ends up happening sometimes is we get in the habit of ending the engagement, meaning the interaction with the bag, with our opponent. We end it as soon as we hit, as if that's the end of the exchange. It's not the end of the exchange. You have to strike, and then you have to come back and protect yourself, or follow it up with some head movement, follow it up with some defense, follow it up with other strikes. But your last moment of impact is not where the exchange ends with you and your opponent. You have to make sure you bring those hands back to your face when you kick. Same thing. You have to make sure you bring those legs back to the ground. So be wary of ending your energy at the moment of impact, or suddenly after the moment of impact. Make sure you bring your energy all the way back to a safe defensive position or at a distance, so that you get the habit of doing the same thing if you find yourself in exchange out on the street, or if you find yourself in sparring. And then finally, a quick word on how to use the bag appropriately when we throw this cross. So this is a thing I see often, that people don't understand how to use this as a piece of equipment. And I say this in one of the other videos in terms of how to talk about hitting the bag, but specific to the cross, since we're talking about the cross, make sure that your priority is turning the hips and the shoulders. So every cross is going to have at least this, right? You're going to have this. Now, how much you extend your arm really depends on the situation. So if I'm in a really good range and I've kind of figured out with my jab, I know where I need to land, right? Boom, I throw that cross, I throw it, everything's right where I want it to be, and I land on the face, right on the end of the chin, exactly where I want. 95% extending my arm. Not locked out, but like 95%, right? Bang. Beautiful cross. What happens now if I'm close? It's going to happen sometimes on the bag, right? Because I don't know if I'm going to be out here throwing long strikes, or maybe I want to prioritize the hook. Maybe I don't want to throw a big long hook like this. Maybe I want to throw a tight hook. So what does that mean? I'm going to have to adjust how I throw my cross. Now, if you have a pad holder, right, they're going to probably move with you a little bit. They move back, they move forward, or they might simulate this scenario that I'm describing right here. But what you have to do as a disciplined trainer, as a disciplined kickboxing, MMA fighter, when you're working on the bag, is learning how to use the bag appropriately so it doesn't mess up your technique. So all that is a very wordy way to say that if I'm going to throw if I want to throw a nice long, let's say standard cross, I got to make sure I'm at a cross range, which is right about here. I know this myself. I've done this a lot. So I know that I'm right about here is where I want to throw my cross. If I'm in close because I want to throw a nice tight hook, let's say a very perfect, picture perfect hook, I know that when I throw the cross, I still have to prioritize moving the shoulder and the hip, but I'm not going to be able to extend my arm all the way. So my cross just ends up being a short cross. What I see a lot of people do is they do this, because they're close to the bag and they're thinking in their head, oh, I have to extend my arm the entire way. Now, that's us on trainers to let you know how to use the bag appropriately so that when you throw the cross, you make the proper adjustment, whether I'm here, right? Or if I'm here and I still want to extend my arm, know to step back, right? So if you're on the bag and you want to throw this, if you want to get in close to throw a really tight hook and you want to throw a cross right after, let's say like a 3-2. Now, when you throw that cross, you just still move the shoulder and hip. This doesn't change, right? But I turn and I just throw a short cross, as opposed to throwing it like this, which just plain looks silly, we know that, or pushing myself back, pushing my shoulders back, because there's no power in that. I don't have to extend the arm if my hips and my shoulders go to it. This is what's supporting me. So bang, I need to get that cross in there without extending my arm fully. You don't want to also land and then try to shove the bag. That doesn't do anything for anybody, right? It's not how we punch, and it's not going to be effective. So if you're close, throw the cross short. If you're at a perfect distance, boom, you throw the cross at that perfect distance. If you're close and you have decided, I want to throw a long cross, I want to throw a fully extended cross, then adjust your foot position. So what I did somewhere in the middle there was I stepped back so I could throw that cross. And I come back, bah, bah. Maybe I throw some inside work, bang, I come through. Maybe I throw a short cross, I step back, then I get my distance and I throw another long cross. So always prioritize moving the shoulder and the hip and the foot, and then the extension of the arm is something that happens kind of in the moment, depending on how far away the bag is and where you are in the middle of a combination. All right, I hope all that made sense. If you have any questions, feel free to email me as always, but drill those couple things, watch yourself in the mirror, videotape yourself so you have an idea to see if you were doing any of those things, either those pitfalls that I said to be careful of or the correct things I said to do. Turning your hip, turning your shoulder, turning the knuckle over, keeping the hand up. So watch yourself, practice, hit me if you have any questions. Have some fun training.